Hello there. I've been asked to talk about the film Hostiles. I don't normally talk about films on this channel, but this is a movie that I happen to have strong feelings about, so why the heck not? Hostiles is a film that I actively hate. Somebody mentions Hostiles to me, I get agitated. And that's kind of weird for me. I don't actively hate a lot of movies. No Country for Old Men, it's way too bleak and unpleasant for me, but that's sort of the end of my feelings towards it. Right? Somebody mentions it to me, it's like, oh, I didn't like that movie, whatever. Hostiles, I get. Well, before we jump into I should get out of the way that I'm not going to be showing any clips from the movie. I got four reasons for that. Well, one, I really don't like this movie and I don't want to watch it again. Number two, I don't want to rent it because I don't like this movie. I don't want to give the filmmakers any more money. I'm satisfied that they lost money with this film. I think that's a good thing. Number three, it's such a pain editing to dodge the copyright bots. It's just tedious. And number four is that I don't want to give you a false impression of the quality of this movie. This film is quite bad in terms of its content, but technically it's quite well done. The cinematographer did a good job. The cameraman did a good job. The gaffering, second to none. So any shot I show you from this film is going to look a lot better than the film actually is, right? Because every shot looks good. Right? So if I show you some clip of the film, you're going to look at it and think, oh, that looks pretty good. I want to watch that. That's how I got sucked into it in the first place. It's a good looking film. It's just the content that's egregious. The script is quite bad. The direction is quite bad. The film is quite racist. All of that aside, it's very boring as well. So the film is racist. Let's talk about that. There's several ways that a film can be racist. So on the one hand, you've got the overtly racist films, the films that are like, white supremacy is the only truth, therefore my film is going to be racist, and that's a good thing. And you should all be ashamed for not being racist. There's that type of film which doesn't really get made anymore. Then there's the sort of incidentally racist film. So this is like those John Ford westerns. He doesn't necessarily know that they're racist. He doesn't really care that they're racist. I'm trying to make a movie about Indians. I don't care about the race angle. It's just not important to the director. Hostiles isn't like either of those. It's not overtly racist, it's covertly racist. The filmmaker wants you to believe that it's actually an anti-racist film. The filmmaker wants himself to believe that it's actually an anti-racist film. The filmmaker is tricking himself into thinking this film is something other than it is. And that's what makes me so frustrated with this movie. Stagecoach kind of knows what it is and doesn't really care. Hostiles doesn't know what it's saying. It doesn't realize that it's saying something abhorrent. And that's sort of what I want to talk about today. So the problems I have with this film can be divided into three general categories. First, you got the thematic problems. Second, you got the historical problems. Third, you got the representational problems. So first, the thematic problems. One of the primary themes of this film is moral ambiguity, moral equivalency. Look, the Indians, they were doing some bad stuff, but we were doing bad stuff to them in return. So it's a morally gray, morally dubious situation. The problem with this is it's a false equivalency. The Old West, the Cowboys and Indians situation, it wasn't morally gray at all. The Cowboys are in the wrong. Now, how do I know they're in the wrong? Because they had the ability to avoid hostilities. Everybody who went out west, apart from the wives and the children and the slaves, chose to be there. Worse, they knew what they were getting in for. So at the start of this film, there's an Indian massacre. Comanches come and burn down some isolated farmstead, kill the farmer, kill his kids. Only the wife escapes. She becomes one of the protagonists. The film paints the farmer and his kids as victims. The farmer is the victim, but he's also in the wrong. He chose to be there knowing that this was on the table. American mythology, the frontier myth, there's Indians out there in the woods, a bunch of bloodthirsty barbarians who want nothing more than to eat your babies and take their skin. Okay? That's the mythology they were raised on. That mythology goes back to the 1600s. This farmer in the film who gets killed, he knew this was out there. This is what he believes is out there on the frontier, and he decides to take his children into this environment. This is like a man at a zoo who lowers his children into the bear enclosure so that they can get a better look. It's actually worse than that, though, because why would he take his children, take his family into what he believes is a war zone? Why would he do this? He'd do it because he thought he could win. Because in the cowboys and Indian stories, the Indians always lose. It's a cliche that persists to this day, that the Indians always die at the end of the movie. This movie's no exception. So what this guy thought was he was going to go out there and he was going to be the protagonist of one of those dime novels. Right? The Indians come riding blindly towards him, and he gets his shotgun, and he's got both barrels, bang, bang, and he gets 3 Indians. And he reloads effortlessly. And he goes bang, bang, he gets 3 more Indians with both 2 shots. That's what he thought he was going to do. He thought he was going to go out there and prove how much of a big man he was. So it's actually like the father who lowers his kids into a bear enclosure and then jumps in because he wants to bare knuckle box the bear just to prove how tough he is. This guy's an idiot. He's the victim in this situation, but he's entirely responsible for what happened to him. Now, he could have chosen to just stay in the East. Right? That was an option available to everybody who settled the Old West. How do I know that that's an option? Because most people took it. When the frontiers opened, the East didn't suddenly depopulate. Europe didn't suddenly depopulate. Most people stayed home. The people who went out west were the rare exceptions. Most people decided, actually, I care about my immortal soul as much as I pretend to. I would rather be a good Christian and not murder people. I would rather go to heaven than steal Indian land. Right? Most people chose the moral option. The people who went out west were the immoral exception. Let's talk a little bit more about moral equivalency. The film attempts to paint this in a dishonest way. The opening of the film, the first scene of the film portrays in graphic detail an Indian raid on an isolated farmstead. It's very brutal and ugly and unpleasant, and it's lingering and deliberate. We don't get to see that for the other side. There's not a Little Big Man type of scene where U.S. Army comes in and just starts mowing people down with machine guns. We don't get that scene. The film's pretending that it's being morally equivalent, but that's not what we're shown. Now, the film mentions the Battle of Wounded Knee, but showing is not equivalent to telling. So we get to see firsthand the Indian violence. We don't get to see the U.S. Army violence. That's not an equivalency. The filmmaker here is illiterate. That is not an equivalency. He's painting one much more strongly than he's painting the other. This theme that they put into the film is illiterate, poorly delivered, and just kind of gross. So the next set of problems with this film are historical. What can we say about this opening scene in the film from a historical perspective? We can say that it's wrong. The film is set in, I think, 1892, maybe 1893, I don't remember the date. One of the two. Now, why is this a problem? Because this is the reservation era. There weren't Indian raids on farmsteads in this period. That stuff was over and done with. It had been over and done with for a while. That sort of stuff is more typical of the 1840s than the 1890s. Do you want to know what an Indian massacre looks like in the 1890s? Here's what it looks like. An East Coast Indian has come out west because he wants to get a job working as a scout. He's in a tavern, he's gambling, he drinks too much, right? There's a bar fight, and a white guy ends up stabbed. Indian immediately gets gunned down by the cops. This is an Indian massacre in the 1890s, right? The only reason they call it a massacre is because that sells newspapers. That's the sort of violence that happens in the 1890s. It's not people coming out and raiding caravans. Because in this period, just about everybody was on Indian reserves and disarmed. It's incorrect to have an Indian raid on a farmstead in 1892. Another problem with that. So the film goes out of its way to make it clear that it's the Comanche raiding this farmstead. This is doubly wrong. The Comanche had been defeated in the 1870s. They'd had their population reduced to less than 1,000. They'd been pushed onto an Indian reserve. They'd been disarmed. They'd had all their horses confiscated. In the 1890s, the Comanche were no longer the warlike horse lords of American mythology. Now they were a defeated people, a subjugated people barely clinging to existence. So why does the film pick the Comanche for this raid? The film picks the Comanche for this raid for extremely cynical purposes. See, the average filmgoer is a little bit more politically correct now than back in the day. If they'd picked the Sioux for this Indian raid, average filmgoer might have had something to say about it. The Comanche are one of the only indigenous groups that pop culture is still okay with you demonizing. The reason for that is that the Comanche, at the height of their power, they were very violent. They were probably the most unambiguously violent group in North America. The reason the Comanche are still okay to be demonized is that if I call you out for demonizing them, the racist can just say, oh, this is just what actually happened. You're anti-fact, you're anti-truth. Yeah, the Comanche did raid a lot of farmsteads in 1840. They weren't raiding farmsteads in the 1890s. This is wrong. The filmmakers do not have a historical leg to stand on. They don't have a defense for their demonization. They picked the Comanche because they thought they could get away with it. This is the same mentality that allowed people to go out and steal land. That's very frustrating for me. What makes these historical inaccuracies doubly frustrating is the film's attention to historical detail in other areas. So there's a whole bunch of these sort of accurate historical details that only reenactor pedants would care about. So like one of them, the main character, Christian Bale, he's a veteran of the Indian Wars, and he's leading a group of recruits on this mission. And he's got a hat from the 1860s issue, whereas his recruits have got hats from the 1890s issue. The film cares about historical accuracy in the sort of stitch counting nerd way. It doesn't care about it in ways that actually matter. It's extremely frustrating. Hats are more worthy of historical accuracy than Indians, and this film pretends it's being tolerant. Like, what the... Okay, so let's talk about the representation angle. So you got the poster of this film, you got three people. You got Christian Bale, you got Rosamund Pike, you got Wes Studi. You'd think these are the three protagonists. Now, Rosamund Pike gives a really good performance. She does a really good job. Christian Bale does a fine performance. He's not just a block of wood like he normally is. I'd like to say that Wes Studi does a great job, but the fact of the matter is they don't give him a job to do. Wes Studi just plays the typical Wes Studi character that he always plays. I think he's got like 4 lines in this whole bloody film. It's very frustrating. They don't give him any acting to do. Wes Studi's career is extremely frustrating because he's a highly talented actor. He's probably the most recognizable name in Indigenous cinema, and he's basically only been called on to play the same character. Wes Studi's job in basically every film he's in is just to do this. Right, just scowl. Scowl at people, just glare at people. Be the big scary Indian in the background. That's basically all he ever gets called on to do. This is the biggest name in Indigenous cinema, and that's all he ever gets called on to do. This film's got a couple other big names. It's got Adam Beach. This film's got Adam Beach in it. Now, Adam Beach, he's a pretty decent actor. He's got great on-screen charisma. He's one of those people who's just entertaining to watch. Adam Beach's career is also extremely frustrating because he doesn't get a lot of parts that make use of him. If Adam Beach had been a white fella, I think he could have been a leading actor, right? He could have been a proper celebrity. So what does this film do with Adam Beach, this fellow who's a decent actor with great charisma? Well, he just stands there. Like that, just glaring at people. You know, Adam Beach, here's what I want you to do. Just stand over there and be the big scary Indian in the background, right? I think Adam Beach has got like 1 line in this film and then he gets killed. These are 2 of the biggest names in Indigenous cinema, and the film doesn't do anything with them. Just stand there looking scary, glower at people. Let's give a simile. This is like if I got my film and I had, okay, who are 2 of the biggest names in American cinema? Okay, let's say Robert De Niro and Tom Hanks. So I got my film with Robert De Niro and Tom Hanks, and what I'm going to have them do is stand in the background and glare at people. That's all I'm going to have them do, and then they get killed in the end. Right? What a waste of your talent. This film makes no use of its Indigenous talent. That's so... There are so few films that even have a place for Indigenous talent much less a central place like in the narrative of this story, and yet this film doesn't do anything with them. It just squanders that opportunity. It's infuriating. All that he has Adam Beach do in this film is just... unironically, unjokingly, I could play Adam Beach's part in this film, and I could do just as good a job as him, because they don't give him a job to do. Just look big and scary. So let's talk about the ending. So in the end of this film, all the Indians are dead except for the kid. This is a tired cliche with racist origins. The origin of this is manifest destiny. Those Indians, they're doomed to die out. They're going extinct. There's going to be, at best, 1, maybe 2 generations of Indians left, and they've been saying that for 300 years. The Indians all die at the end is a manifestation of that racist ideology. It's very frustrating to see that persist into film. That's one of the most persistent of the old racist tropes. I've seen this in a lot of films. Hell or High Water, that was a recent example. Now, for people who don't see why a cliche like that is a problem, let's imagine that you're watching a film and there's an American character. And you go, oh, okay, he's going to die at the end, I better not get attached to him. And then he does. Imagine if that's your association with American characters, and you're proved right more often than not. Don't you see why that would be a problem? Don't you see how exhausting that would be as part of that demographic? That's what this cliche is like. It's worse than that, though, because in this film they die pointlessly. They don't even die for a narrative purpose. They die completely pointlessly. A bunch of hicks appear, and then Christian Bale starts a gunfight, and then all the Indians get killed. It's worse than that because there were other solutions to this which are obvious. The film utilizes them earlier. Earlier in the film, they encounter violence from another group of hicks. So what do? Well, they sneak in at night and gut the hicks. There's no reason why they couldn't do that same approach here. They've already proven that it works. Why does Christian Bale decide to start a gunfight? He does it because the director wants him to do it. It gets worse, though, because this is painted as the hero's great redemptive moment. This is the moment the film has been building up for. The hero, he's going to fight beside his Indians. Well, you didn't have to fight for them, and you get them all killed. This isn't a redemptive moment. This is you screwing them over one last time. This is not the narrative that you think you're presenting, director. This is not the narrative you think you're presenting. It gets worse, because this scene would have been a lot better if Christian Bale had been the one who dies. Imagine this scene. You got the Indian fighter, the seasoned Indian fighter who starts out the film as a racist. Throughout the film he grows, and in the end he dies to protect his friends. Right? That's the full circle. It's the typical Christian cliche of redemption through blood. The villain is redeemed by dying. It would be so much more poignant if Christian Bale was the one who didn't make it out of this gunfight. It's extremely frustrating. It's worse than that, though. The ending of this film is worse than that, though, because only Indian left at the end is the kid. So what happens? Do they send him back to his people, try and find some cousins, an uncle and aunt for the kid to live with? No. Christian Bale and Rosamund Pike adopt him, and then they ride the train off into the sunset back into civilization. So the ending of this film is the one surviving Indian gets 60 scooped. How tone deaf do you have to be to put this in your film? How bloody tone deaf do you have to be to put this in your film? What this tells me is that the director or the writer or whoever is responsible for this has never once paid attention to any of the talking points coming out of Indian country. It also fits in perfectly with the all the Indians die at the end racist cliche, because this kid, he's not going to be an Indian. He's not going to be a Cheyenne anymore. He's going to be brought up as a white kid. The bittersweet ending of this film, the hero gets his redemption, the Indians all get killed, the kid gets 60 scooped. Like, in what world is this an okay thing to put in your film, which is ostensibly about tolerance? It's just... oh, it's so infuriating. I'm gonna just conclude this. This is a bad movie. It's setting aside the racism, which I've talked too much about. It's also very boring and slow. It's not like a good slow, not like 2001. This is a boring slow. It's not an entertaining movie. It's excessively and tastelessly violent and brutal. Even if it wasn't undermining its message, the message it's trying to promote has no depth. Disney's Pocahontas promotes basically the same message as this film and does it better. And Disney's Pocahontas is no cinematic triumph. This film is wholly without merit. Don't watch it. Um, Thank you for watching this. I hope you found this interesting.